It was a rainy evening in the city, the streets shimmering under the glow of streetlights as raindrops created endless ripples in the puddles below. Out of the gloom emerged a dog, its fur drenched, its breaths quick and labored. It moved with purpose, dodging passing cars and weaving through the sparse crowd, barking insistently at anyone who would look its way. The few pedestrians who paused to glance dismissed it as just another stray, but this dog wasn't lost, it was determined. Its path led it to the large, imposing structure of the FBI headquarters. The dog stopped at the entrance, barking louder now, its front paws scratching at the glass door with urgency. Inside, a pair of guards stood at their posts, one glancing out and nudging his partner with a chuckle. "Looks like we've got a visitor," he said with amusement, his voice echoing faintly in the quiet lobby. "Must be hungry," the other replied with a smirk. But as they watched, the dog's behavior grew more frantic. It pawed at the door, then turned to bark directly at the guards, its eyes wide and pleading. One of them stepped closer, curious now, and that's when the dog darted forward, gently tugging at his pants with its teeth before releasing and backing away, its gaze fixed on him with a desperate intensity. "What the? Is it trying to tell us something?" the guard muttered, exchanging a puzzled look with his partner. The dog barked again, turning toward the door and back as if urging them to follow. Something about its determination struck them, and though skeptical, they decided to call it in. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't just a dog looking for attention. It was delivering a message, a cry for help that would lead them into the darkest investigation of their careers. The dog sat patiently outside the towering glass doors of the FBI headquarters, its fur dripping with rain, as if waiting for someone to finally notice. Inside, two agents walked past the lobby, their attention drawn by the faint but persistent sound of barking. One of them paused, peering through the glass at the drenched animal. "That dog's been out there for a while now," he said, his brow furrowing. His partner glanced over dismissively. "It's just a stray, probably looking for shelter from the rain." The first agent lingered, his curiosity piqued. The dog's gaze was unyielding, fixed on the doors as though it knew what lay beyond them. Moments later, the security guard stepped out into the rain, his umbrella shielding him from the downpour. "Hey there, buddy," he said, crouching cautiously as the dog approached. But instead of retreating like most strays, the dog barked insistently, then tugged at the hem of his uniform with its teeth. The guard froze, startled by the animal's strange behavior. "What's it doing?" one of the agents asked, stepping outside to join him. The dog released the fabric and turned in a circle, barking again, its body language urging them to act. By now, the small crowd in the lobby had grown curious, watching the bizarre interaction unfold. One agent finally bent down, his expression softening. "You trying to show us something?" he murmured. The dog barked sharply in response, then started to trot away, pausing only to look back and ensure it was being followed. "This is ridiculous," the second agent muttered, shaking his head. But his partner was already moving, signaling for backup. "Something's not right here. Let's see where this goes," he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of caution and intrigue. The dog led them out of the city's bustling streets and into quieter, darker paths. It navigated through alleys and back roads with surprising confidence, as though retracing its steps. The agents followed in silence, their flashlights slicing through the rain-soaked night. With each turn, the tension grew. The dog occasionally glanced back, its eyes meeting theirs briefly before pushing forward again. As they ventured deeper into the outskirts, the agents exchanged uneasy glances. They had no idea where they were going or what they would find, but one thing was certain, the dog wasn't leading them astray. As they moved further into the quiet, deserted area, the dog's urgency only seemed to grow. It wasn't stopping to rest or sniff around like any ordinary animal. It was leading them somewhere, pulling ahead with a single-minded determination. The two agents stayed close behind, their footsteps heavy against the wet ground, the silence of the night broken only by the occasional bark from the dog and the distant sound of rain tapping against the trees. One of the agents, his hand resting on his gun, kept a wary eye on their surroundings. "This is getting weird," he muttered, glancing around the darkened area. The other agent nodded, his face tense. We're miles away from the city now. What the hell is out here? They both knew there was no reason for this dog to be leading them to such a remote part of town, yet they couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something big. The dog slowed briefly and looked back at them, its eyes locked onto theirs as if urging them to hurry. Then it continued forward, crossing into a narrow path lined with overgrown bushes and thorns. The agents followed, stepping carefully through the mud, their senses heightened. They were on edge, unsure of what they might encounter, but something in the dog's behavior kept them moving forward. Eventually, the dog stopped at the edge of a small clearing, its ears perked and its tail straight. It barked sharply, then ran toward a pile of debris near a thick cluster of trees. The agents exchanged a glance, then cautiously approached. The dog stood back now, watching them intently as the agents knelt to examine the pile. At first, it seemed like nothing more than discarded trash, a pile of old clothes, some empty cans, and bits of wood, but then one of the agents noticed something strange. There, half buried beneath the debris, was a piece of torn fabric. It was dark, blood-stained, and unmistakably fresh. The first agent's heart skipped a beat as he carefully pulled the fabric free, revealing a bloodied shirt. "What the hell is this?" he whispered under his breath. The other agent's face went pale as he crouched down, scanning the area. "This isn't just trash," he said, his voice now filled with disbelief. "This is evidence." The dog stood still, watching them as if it knew exactly what it had led them to. A cold shiver ran down the agent's spines. The pieces were starting to come together, but neither of them could yet comprehend what they were about to uncover. The dog's role had shifted. It was no longer just a guide. It had become a messenger, and the agents had no choice but to follow. The rain had started to let up, but the air was thick with tension. The dog stood still in the clearing, its eyes fixed on the agents as they examined the torn fabric. Neither of them spoke as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. One agent reached for his radio, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need backup. We've found something." His partner, still crouching near the fabric, glanced up. "You think this is connected to the missing persons case?" he asked, his voice edged with concern. The dog gave a sharp bark, almost as if in response. Both agents looked at it. The dog's stance hadn't shifted. It was still as alert as ever. "Yeah," the agent said slowly, his hand gripping his flashlight tighter. "I think this just became a whole lot bigger." The clearing seemed oddly quiet now, and the closer the agents got to the source of the fabric, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. There was something off about this place, something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. As they scanned the area, one agent spotted something else near the base of a tree, barely visible in the dim light, a set of footprints leading deeper into the woods. They were fresh, and the mud was still soft around them. "Those can't be ours," the second agent said, pointing to the tracks. The first agent nodded grimly. "Someone's been out here recently." They stood up, now fully alert, scanning their surroundings as the dog, without hesitation, moved forward again, nose to the ground. With renewed urgency, they followed the dog, whose pace had quickened as it led them deeper into the woods. The path was becoming harder to navigate, twisting and narrowing between thick trees, brambles, and rocks. The further they went, the darker it became, the shadows growing deeper as the last remnants of daylight slipped away. The dog moved with uncanny precision, its focus unwavering. The agents exchanged tense looks, their hands tightening on their weapons as they moved swiftly behind the dog. Suddenly, the animal stopped, its ears perked up, and it gave a low, cautious growl. Both agents froze instantly, their eyes darting around the dark woods, every sense on high alert. What had the dog sensed? What were they about to walk into? Ahead, through the trees, a faint light glowed, a small, flickering candlelight from what appeared to be a cabin hidden in the woods. It stood there in the silence, unassuming but menacing, surrounded by overgrown foliage. The dog took a few cautious steps toward it, then turned back to the agents, pausing to make sure they were following. The agents exchanged one last look, their hearts pounding. They had no idea what awaited them inside that cabin, but one thing was clear: they had come too far to turn back now. The cabin loomed ahead, barely visible through the thick trees. The faint light flickered from behind a window, casting long shadows across the darkened ground. The dog's step slowed as it approached, its ears perked and its body tense. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, pausing as though deciding what to do next. The two agents, now just a few yards away, exchanged uneasy glances, their breaths shallow as the weight of the moment settled over them. "This is it," the first agent whispered, his voice low. He took a step forward, his hand instinctively resting on his weapon. The second agent nodded, but there was no certainty in his eyes, only a sense of unease. Neither of them had expected to be standing here, outside this secluded cabin, following a dog with no apparent reason for its persistence. The dog looked back at them, its eyes reflecting the pale glow of the cabin's light. It whined softly before taking a few more steps toward the door. Without hesitation, the agents followed, their steps more cautious now, as if they were crossing into unknown territory. They reached the door, which creaked eerily as it opened, the smell of damp wood and stale air wafting out. The agents exchanged one last glance before stepping inside. The interior of the cabin was dimly lit, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper and the floors covered in dust. The faint scent of something strange lingered in the air, but they couldn't quite place it. The dog moved deeper into the cabin, its nose to the ground, sniffing every corner. It led them into a small, windowless room at the back of the cabin. There, amidst the clutter and decay, the agents found a disturbing sight: old, faded photographs pinned to the wall. Photos of missing people, some of whom had been gone for months. They were eerily familiar faces, people whose cases had haunted local headlines. The second agent's stomach tightened as he scanned the pictures. This doesn't feel right," he muttered under his breath. His partner said nothing, his focus now on something else. The floor beneath them creaked and he froze. The dog stopped at the far corner of the room, growling low and steady. The agents followed its gaze, eyes narrowing as they saw a door half-hidden behind an old bookshelf. The door was slightly ajar, and the faint sound of muffled voices could be heard from within. Without speaking, the agents moved toward the door, their hands poised on their weapons. The dog stepped aside, watching them intently, its growl fading into an eerie silence. The agents pushed the door open slowly, their breaths shallow as the room beyond revealed its sinister secret. What they found inside would haunt them forever. There, in the dim light, were makeshift cages, remnants of a horrifying operation. Maps with pins marking locations, photographs of people trapped in what appeared to be some sort of elaborate trap, and worse yet, the faint sounds of someone breathing heavily from a corner of the room. The agents exchanged a glance, their hearts racing as they realized what they had just uncovered. This was no ordinary cabin. This was a place of unimaginable darkness, and the dog had led them here for a reason. As they moved to investigate further, the full weight of the situation hit them. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was a race against time. The room was suffocating, the air thick with a sense of impending danger. The agents stood frozen for a moment, absorbing the horrific sight before them. The dog, its posture tense, stayed a few steps back, watching them with an intensity that was almost knowing. The first agent reached into his jacket and pulled out his radio, his hand shaking slightly as he keyed it. "This is Agent Carter. We need immediate backup. We've found a secure location, possible kidnapping operation." His voice was steady, but the weight of what they had uncovered was starting to settle in. As the radio crackled to life, the second agent's gaze didn't leave the horrifying setup before him. The walls were adorned with maps, showing routes, locations, and more pinned photographs of missing persons, all marked with red X's or circling annotations. The makeshift cages were positioned in the corners of the room, each one unsettlingly empty, but their presence spoke volumes. There was a grim sense of finality to it all. Whoever had run this operation had been meticulous, cold, and calculating. "This is insane," the second agent muttered, glancing at his partner. How long have they been running this? How many people are involved? Carter's eyes scanned the room again, his jaw clenched tight. We don't know yet, but this is bigger than we thought. The dog shifted in place, its growl growing louder, more menacing, and the agents instinctively raised their weapons, eyes narrowing as they heard the faint sound of shuffling from the far corner of the room. There, a figure slowly emerged from the shadows, its face hidden beneath a mask. It moved with a purposeful, methodical pace, but the moment the dog's growl hit its ears, it froze, looking toward the entrance. The figure was just as surprised to see the agents as they were to see it. Without a word, the agent's instincts kicked in. FBI, freeze! Carter shouted, his weapon aimed steadily at the figure. But the person didn't flinch. Instead, they took a step backward, trying to move toward the back of the room. Get down! Carter ordered, and they lunged forward, forcing the figure into submission with trained precision. The second agent moved quickly, securing the suspect, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of more threats. The dog, still on edge, stood at the ready, barking furiously, sensing the heightened tension. It had led them here, directly into the heart of this operation, and now it stood as the silent sentinel, ensuring no further danger would approach. Carter looked back at the dog and nodded. You did good, he muttered, his voice barely audible. The dog's ears perked, and it wagged its tail in what seemed like acknowledgement. It had led them to the heart of a criminal network, unraveling a plot that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. And now, thanks to its persistence, they had a suspect in custody and a whole operation to dismantle. The cabin had fallen into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft growl of the dog and the rustling of the agent's movements as they secured the suspect. Carter's grip tightened on his radio, and he called for backup again, urgency creeping into his voice. This is Agent Carter. We have a suspect in custody, but we need more units. We've uncovered a kidnapping operation. There's more going on here. His partner, Agent Davis, scanned the room, his hand on his weapon as he checked every corner, wary of hidden threats. The dog stood still, watching them both, its body poised in a ready stance, sensing the shift in energy. The suspect, a masked figure who had not spoken a word since they apprehended them, was bound to a chair in the center of the room, their eyes darting between the agents and the dog. Carter stepped closer, his voice firm. We know what you've been doing here. You've been kidnapping people, innocent people. Who else is involved in this? The figure remained silent, not a single word escaping their lips. Davis moved forward, his tone colder. You're not leaving here until you tell us everything. Who else is running this operation? The silence was suffocating, the tension thick enough to cut through. The dog let out a low, unsettling growl, sensing the pressure building. The agents exchanged a brief glance, and Carter signaled for Davis to check the rest of the cabin for any other signs of life. I'll stay here. We're not letting this one slip, Carter said. Davis nodded and began moving through the narrow hallway toward the back of the cabin. The dog followed him briefly, its eyes never leaving the suspect. Carter remained in the room, watching the figure carefully. Suddenly, a muffled voice came from the other room, faint but clear. Help me, please. Carter's heart raced, and he rushed toward the voice. The dog's ears perked up, and it led the way, its movements quick and precise. They reached a small, concealed closet at the back of the cabin. The door was cracked open, revealing a terrified young woman, bound and gagged. Her eyes widened with relief as she saw the agents and the dog. Carter immediately moved to untie her, his voice gentle as he reassured her. You're safe now. We've got you. The woman's tears flowed freely, and she clung to Carter as he helped her stand. The dog, standing beside them, wagged its tail, its mission now complete. One survivor, Carter muttered under his breath. But how many more are there? The weight of the question hung in the air as Davis rejoined them. Nothing else in the back, but this is bigger than we thought. We need to bring the whole operation down. The agents exchanged determined looks. This was only the beginning of unraveling a twisted network, and they weren't going to stop until they found the rest of the missing people. As they gathered their prisoner and the survivor, Carter looked at the dog one last time. "You did it," he said quietly. The dog barked in acknowledgement, then turned, ready to lead them toward the next part of the investigation. As the agents prepared to leave, Carter couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Without the dog's persistence, they would never have discovered this place. It had been their guide, their unexpected hero, and now it was part of the team, whether they liked it or not. As the night wore on, the rain had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, damp fog hanging in the air. The cabin, now a crime scene, was surrounded by flashing lights as more agents arrived to take control. Carter and Davis, still processing everything they'd just uncovered, stood near the perimeter, their eyes scanning the area. The dog, now calm but still alert, stayed close by their side, its gaze fixed on the dark woods behind them. The investigation was just beginning. The area was swarming with forensic teams, and the survivors had been taken to safety. The suspect was in custody, but Carter knew this was far from over. The network they'd uncovered was vast, and it stretched beyond the cabin, beyond this remote location. This was only the tip of the iceberg. "We've got a long road ahead of us," Davis said, his voice grave. This wasn't just some random operation. This was organized, planned out for months, maybe even years. He paused, glancing at the dog. "And we wouldn't have found any of this without it." Carter nodded. "Yeah, we owe this little guy more than we can say. It didn't stop, not once, until it brought us here. Whatever's going on, this dog knows more than we do." He bent down, patting the dog on the head as it looked up at him with intelligent eyes. "You're not just a stray, are you?" The dog gave a low whine, almost as if answering. Just then, another agent approached them, a file in hand. "Carter, Davis," he said, looking at the two agents with a serious expression. "We've been going through the photographs we found in the cabin. They match a list of missing persons cases that date back years. We've only scratched the surface." Carter's heart sank as he processed the information. The missing persons, those faces from the photographs, had been part of something much larger than they'd ever imagined. "How many?" he asked, his voice tight. "At least 20, maybe more," the agent replied. "And it looks like this network stretches across multiple states. There's a lot more we need to uncover." The reality of the situation hit them like a ton of bricks. The scale of the operation, the number of lives affected, was beyond anything they'd anticipated. And yet, there was still more to uncover, more people in danger. Carter straightened up, his jaw clenched with resolve. "We'll find them," he said, his voice determined. "We'll bring every single one of them home." Davis glanced down at the dog, who was now sitting calmly at Carter's feet. "And we're not doing it alone." The dog gave a soft bark as if in agreement. It had led them to this point, and now it would continue to guide them. There was no turning back. The case had taken a dark turn, but they were committed. With the dog by their side, they were ready to face whatever came next. As the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, Carter, Davis, and the dog prepared to move forward. They had a long road ahead of them, but this was no longer just a job, it was personal. They were on a mission, and they wouldn't stop until the entire network was dismantled and every missing person was brought home. The morning sun began to rise, casting a faint light over the forest as Carter, Davis, and the dog stood at the edge of the crime scene. The fog from the night before had started to dissipate, but the sense of unease still lingered in the air. The agents exchanged silent glances, knowing that their work was far from over. The first light of dawn brought clarity, but also a new layer of responsibility. The missing persons cases, the network, the horrors they had uncovered, it all seemed overwhelming. But they couldn't afford to be overwhelmed now, not when there were still lives at stake. Carter checked his phone and saw the first batch of information coming in from their colleagues. The photos, the maps, the evidence, it was all being processed. But what really haunted him were the faces of the missing people that kept flashing in his mind. Each one a reminder of how deep this operation had run, how many lives had been destroyed. "We have to keep pushing," Carter said, more to himself than anyone else. Davis nodded, his gaze unwavering as he looked back at the cabin. "Yeah, we're just getting started." But we're not doing this alone anymore. We've got help. He glanced down at the dog, who was now walking calmly by their side, its eyes sharp and focused as it trotted alongside them. It had been more than just a guide, it had been their anchor, the key that unlocked the mystery and led them to this point. The dog's steady presence gave them a sense of reassurance, a reminder that no matter how dark the situation seemed, they were not alone in the fight. The road ahead would be long, and they knew that more dangers awaited them. But for now, with their suspect in custody and the first clues falling into place, they had a small victory. They had the dog. Carter took a deep breath, his determination growing with each passing second. "Let's get to work," he said, signaling for Davis to move out. The dog, as if on cue, began to lead the way once again, its tail held high, as if it too knew there was still much to be done. The agents followed, their steps steady, their resolve unshaken. With every piece of evidence they uncovered, with every lead they followed, the picture became clearer. This network was large, it was well organized, but it wasn't invincible. They were going to dismantle it, piece by piece, and with the dog's help, they were one step closer. As they walked back toward the vehicles, the agents knew they were not just investigating a criminal network, they were rescuing lives. Every missing person, every face on those photographs, was now their mission. And they wouldn't stop until they found them all. The dog looked up at Carter, its eyes filled with quiet understanding, and barked softly. It was a small sound, but it was enough to let Carter know they were in this together. They weren't just partners anymore, they were a team. With one last look at the foggy forest behind them, Carter, Davis, and the dog got into their vehicle and drove off. They didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: their fight had only just begun. Asterisk,